November 11, 1918. The guns fall silent. Britain has won the Great War. The Union Jack flies over an empire covering a quarter of the globe. In London, crowds dance in Trafalgar Square, celebrating triumph over tyranny. To the world, Britain appears invincible, the undisputed master of the global order. But inside the treasury buildings of Whitehall, there is no celebrating. The men managing the nation's ledgers know a terrifying secret. Victory has bankrupted the victor. Britain spent £7 billion fighting the war, equivalent to over $300 billion today. To finance the armies and fleets needed to defeat Germany, Britain burned through wealth. They liquidated foreign investments, selling railways in Argentina and mines in Africa. When those reserves ran dry, they borrowed. By 1919, national debt had exploded from £650 million to $7.7 billion, roughly 135% of GDP. Much was owed to the United States, payable in dollars. The Britain emerging from the trenches was fundamentally different. Before 1914, Britain was the world's creditor. Now it was a debtor. British exports had collapsed by 40%. Its core industries, coal mining, shipbuilding, steel production, were bloated and technologically backward compared to new rivals. But the British elite refused to accept this reality. They viewed the damage as temporary. There was a desperate hunger to return to normalcy. And for the ruling class, normalcy meant one thing: the gold standard. For nearly a century, the gold standard had anchored the global economy. Every major currency was pegged to gold. You could walk into the Bank of England with a £5 note and demand 5 gold sovereigns. Because the pound was as good as gold, it became the world's reserve currency. This financial dominance was the bedrock of British imperial power. When war started in 1914, Britain suspended the gold standard. They needed to print money, far more than they had gold to back it up. The result was predictable: inflation. During the war, prices more than doubled. By 1920, the pound, worth $4.86 before the war, traded as low as $3.40. To the proud men in London, this was national humiliation. A weak currency meant a weak nation. They viewed devaluation as moral failure, a betrayal of British financial integrity. There was universal consensus among the elite that Britain must return to the gold standard. But it wasn't enough to just go back to gold. They were determined to return at the exact pre-war rate of 4.86 cents. They wanted to turn back the clock, to pretend the economic devastation had never happened. This decision was driven by pride, nostalgia, and desperate desire. To force the pound back up required massive economic adjustment. The government would engineer brutal deflation, making money scarce and expensive, forcing prices and wages down until the pound could look the dollar in the eye again. It was deliberate economic strangulation, undertaken believing the pain was necessary medicine to restore the nation's financial soul. They were about to sacrifice the real economy of factories and workers on the altar of financial prestige. To execute the return to gold, the Bank of England, led by Governor Montagu Norman, made money scarce. They raised interest rates, restricting credit to businesses. The Treasury slashed government spending. The goal was to squeeze the economy until prices dropped. It was economic anorexia, the country trying to starve itself back into shape. By the early 1920s, this policy was inflicting deep wounds. While bankers applauded the strengthening currency, the industrial heartlands bled. As the pound got stronger, British goods became more expensive for foreign buyers. British industry was being priced out of the global market by its own government. Unemployment climbed to 1.5 million. But the financial elite regarded this suffering with detached stoicism, viewing unemployment as necessary adjustment. In 1924, Winston Churchill was named Chancellor of the Exchequer. He knew almost nothing about economics. He was a romantic who loved history, empire, and grand gestures. The high priests of finance whispered seductively that it was his destiny to put Britain back on gold, the only way to restore Britain's honor. But Churchill had doubts. He worried about what this policy would do to the working man. In private memos, he questioned why finance should override industry. "I would rather see finance less proud and industry more content." To resolve his doubts, Churchill hosted a famous dinner party, inviting the leading proponents but also their most vocal critic, economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes laid out a devastating argument. the pre-war rate of 4.86 cents was fantasy. Based on relative production costs, the pound was worth about 10% less. If Churchill forced the pound back to 4.86 cents, he would artificially overvalue the currency by 10%. Every British exporter would be slapped with a 10% tax on their goods. To make British goods competitive again, companies would have to cut costs by 10%. Since the biggest cost was labor, that meant cutting wages. If you do this, you are declaring war on the working class. You will force wage cuts that will lead to strikes, social chaos, and destruction of British industry. Churchill listened. He was troubled, but the weight of the establishment was too heavy. They told him Keynes was an eccentric radical. They appealed to his vanity and patriotism. Churchill caved. He chose the advice of bankers over the warning of the economist. On April 28, 1925, Churchill stood in the House of Commons and announced Britain was returning to the gold standard at $4.86. He declared. The House erupted in cheers. The city of London rejoiced. The Times called it a masterpiece of statesmanship. But outside Westminster, reality hit hard. Almost instantly, the price of British coal in international markets jumped. Foreign buyers switched to cheaper German or Polish coal. The coal owners, operating on razor-thin margins, were now losing money. They had only one option: reduce the cost of men. On June 30, 1925, just 2 months after Churchill's speech, coal owners announced they were terminating the wage agreement. Wages would be cut by 13 to 25%, and working hours increased from 7 to 8. Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day. Keynes's prediction had come true. The return to gold transferred the cost of national debt onto the shoulders of the hardest-working citizens. The strong pound was essentially a tax on coal miners to subsidize wine importers. The government, realizing massive strikes were imminent, offered a temporary subsidy for 9 months. It was a band-aid on a bullet wound. Both sides prepared for war. The deadline ran out in May 1926. The owners locked out the miners. On May 3, 1926, solidarity held. The buses stopped. The trains stopped. The docks fell silent. The general strike had begun. 1.7 million workers walked off the job. But the government had prepared. Thousands of volunteers drove buses and ran trains. Churchill treated the strike not as an industrial dispute, but as insurrection. After 9 days, the Trade Union Congress capitulated. They surrendered without securing guarantees for the miners. The miners abandoned, stayed out for 6 more months. By November 1926, starvation forced them back. They accepted longer hours and lower wages, crushed by the golden straitjacket. The government believed they had won, but the boom never came. From 1926 to 1929, while America enjoyed the roaring 20s, Britain sat in the corner. The pound was still overvalued. British goods were still too expensive. To keep the pound pegged, the Bank of England kept interest rates high. At the exact moment British industry needed cheap money to modernize, the gold standard choked off investment. Unemployment never dropped below 1 million. In some industrial towns, 70% of men were out of work. The British elite consoled themselves with ideas of sound money, believing this suffering bought credibility. But in 1929, the game board flipped. The Wall Street crash shattered the global economy. The Great Depression began. The real crisis came in summer 1931, when financial contagion spread across Europe. London banks had lent heavily to Germany. When those assets froze, foreign investors realized the Bank of England didn't have enough gold. The run moved from Berlin to London. The Labour government was trapped. To save the pound, economic orthodoxy demanded they balance the budget. The bankers demanded cuts to unemployment benefits. To save the currency, the government had to cut the lifeline, keeping millions from starvation. In August 1931, a national government formed with one mandate: save the gold standard. They passed an emergency budget, raising taxes and slashing unemployment benefits by 10%. They cut public sector wages, teachers, police, sailors, but they pushed too hard. On September 15, 1931, the Atlantic Fleet at Invergordon mutinied when sailors heard their pay was cut. It was polite, no violence, just refusal to work. But news that the Royal Navy was mutinying sent shockwaves through global markets. The run on the pound became a stampede. In 3 days, the Bank of England lost nearly all its gold reserves. On September 19, 1931, the directors met in emergency session. They looked at empty vaults. The game was up. They had starved miners, crushed industry, slashed benefits, provoked naval mutiny, and endured a decade of stagnation, all to defend the gold standard. And they had failed. On September 20th, Britain suspended the gold standard. The pound would float. The elite braced for apocalypse. But on Monday morning, something strange happened. The pound fell to $3.40, ironically, exactly where it had been in 1919 before this tragic experiment. But the sky didn't fall. There was no hyperinflation. Almost immediately, the economy began to breathe. With a cheaper pound, British goods became competitive. Exports ticked up. The Bank of England slashed interest rates. Cheap money flooded in, sparking a housing boom. New industries, aviation, automobiles, electronics, began to grow. Britain recovered from the Depression faster than the United States, largely because they abandoned the golden straitjacket 2 years before Roosevelt did. The tragedy was complete. The British people realized the suffering of the last decade had been for nothing. It was self-inflicted, caused by men who cared more about past prestige than present reality. Two Britons. In the South, where new industries were based, the boom improved middle-class life. But in the North, the coal fields, shipyards, steel towns, the Depression never ended. These industries had been starved of investment for 10 years. The damage was terminal. In October 1936, 200 men from Jarrow marched 300 miles to London, simply asking for the right to work. When they arrived, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin refused to see them. He gave them £1 for train fare home. The Jarrow Crusade failed to get jobs, but seared the image of the left behind into national consciousness. This bitterness fueled extremism. Sir Oswald Mosley founded the British Union of Fascists, telling unemployed men the only way to save Britain was to crush the bankers. The gold standard disaster also vindicated John Maynard Keynes. Every prediction he made came true. His book, The General Theory, published in 1936, was essentially an autopsy of British policy failures. It revolutionized economics and killed the idea of the gold standard. But lessons are learned too late. When Britain faced Nazi Germany in 1939, it did so weakened. Its industrial base was smaller and less efficient. To fight Hitler, Britain borrowed from the United States on American terms. By 1945, the transfer of wealth was complete. The empire was financially liquidated. The gold Norman and Churchill tried to protect was gone, shipped to Fort Knox to pay for guns to liberate Europe. The story of the golden straitjacket is a tragedy of good intentions. The men who made these decisions were patriots who believed they were restoring national glory. But they committed the cardinal sin of economics. They fell in love with a symbol. They confused the map with the territory. They believed national strength resided in coin value rather than productive people. They sacrificed the real economy to save the financial economy and lost both. Remember this number, $4.86. That was the exchange rate that broke an empire. That was the golden thread that unraveled a century of dominance. That was the price tag of pride. It is a stark reminder, an economy exists to serve society, not satisfy a ledger. When that balance is forgotten, empires fall. Britain's fall began not with a lost battle, but with a policy decision made in a wood-paneled room by men who believed defending a number was more important than defending their people. The golden straitjacket strangled the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And the irony? The moment they took it off, they could breathe again.